law? What are the issues and what should you know? I'm Craig Kahn. I've got going on. This is Team Autismpedia, where we're dedicated to educating you about autism, how you can improve the lives of people with autism. If you're interested in this kind of content, please consider subscribing so you can get our latest videos. Right now, we are live, and it's not just me, but I have a special guest, and I will now let her introduce herself.
Thanks, Craig. My name is Kimberly Cass. I'm an attorney. I'm in Leawood, Kansas. I practice in both Kansas and Missouri, and I've been doing that for about 20 years. And I've been interested in special needs law ever since prior to law school. And I've been working with people with disabilities for throughout my career. And I've particularly worked with a lot of people with autism, both children and adults.
Thank you. So we're going to just talk about all the different types of law that you're going to experience if you have a child who has autism and then throughout the age. So do you want to start us off?
Sure. Well, the first thing that parents of a child with autism are going to run into is when they get into the public school system. There's a federal law called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. People might hear it referred to as IDEA. That is the federal law that sets certain guidelines that public schools have to follow in terms of providing education for children with disabilities. Um, the thing I think parents most need to know about that law is it doesn't say specifically what the school districts have to do. It sets up a process by which they're supposed to figure out what to do. And in terms of what they actually have to provide, the law just simply states they have to provide a free and appropriate public education, otherwise known as FAPE, FAPE is an acronym. There's a lot of acronyms in the law, if you hadn't noticed that. Um, and what does it mean to provide a free, appropriate public education? Well, the emphasis is on the appropriate, and it's individualized per child. So there could be a situation where two different similar children in two different school districts get two different things because those are very subjective and individualized assessments. And if the parents are unhappy with what the school district has decided they can provide, there is a process by which they can challenge it. And it's important for parents to become aware because there are very short timelines within that process for them to set it in motion so they have any say at all if they disagree with their children's education plan. And also just as a small aside, in the education setting, there is something called the Rehabilitation Act, which predates IDEA. And where I see that used most, though, is it's regarding physical access to the school. So it's not typically something that people with autism will run into. But I've also seen situations where school districts will use what's called a 504 plan instead of an individual education plan. So if you are a parent of a child with autism and your school district is trying to write a 504 plan instead of an IEP, you might want to look into that a little bit further. So do you want me to move on from that area and just kind of give the rest of the overview?
Yeah, that's perfect. I'll
Okay.
be collecting any questions that are asked that are good, so that they can be asked at the end of after you're done talking about everything.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Okay, so once you are out of school, you run into a few other things when you become an adult with autism. One of them would be the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. That is a law that was passed in the 80s, I believe. Then it's designed to give people with disabilities access to public accommodations and in the workplace. So where people with autism will run into that is in looking at employment. It, among other things, provides that um, you are entitled to something called reasonable accommodations in your employment. And again, it's kind of a individualized determination as to what's reasonable and what kind of accommodation you might need. But the gist is that if there's something that's reasonable, that's not, you know, cost prohibitive, that your employer could do so that it would make the difference on whether you can do the job or not, then they need to provide that. For example, if you are someone with autism who also has ADHD, which is fairly common, and you might need extra breaks, or you might need the opportunity to take a break in the middle of a difficult task. That's a reasonable accommodation generally that your employer should be able to provide. If you have access to a job coach and you need your job coach present at work with you so that you can get through the tasks that you need, that's something employers should accommodate. It's important to know that you have to ask for those things. The employer isn't required to, sort of fish out whether you need those things and then offer them. You have to ask, and you have to be clear that you're asking as an accommodation for your disability, which of course means that you have to actually have disclosed or told your employer that you have a disability in order for that law to protect you. Um, Another thing that you'll run into when people with autism become adults is a question of whether or not they have the capability to provide for their basic health and safety, and whether they have the capability to handle their own finances. And that's another very individual determination. If you have someone who doesn't have the capacity to, for example, make their own healthcare decisions or pay their own bills and balance their checkbook and things like that, there's a couple of different ways, and you want to choose the least restrictive way that you can choose and still accomplish what needs to be accomplished. A lot of times people will jump to a guardianship or conservatorship, which is a court order essentially placing someone else in charge of those things for you. And at the same time, it takes your rights away to make those choices. So that's a fairly extreme remedy that you don't want to use if you don't need to. If you have autism and you have the capacity to understand and sign a power of attorney, which is just a document giving someone else the authority to make decisions for you, then you can do that and you wouldn't need a court to appoint a guardian or conservator. But if there's no one in your life that you trust that much, or you don't have the capacity to really understand what you're signing when you do that, then you might want to consider a court appointed guardian. Now, guardian can be anyone really that you choose. The court has to find that they're a quote fit and proper person to, provide those services to you. It could well be a parent, it often is, but it doesn't have to be. And I will tell you that this is something that families need to be talking about well before it's needed, because if there's any dispute over who might serve that role, you really want to get that worked out. Because if you end up in court with family members arguing about who gets to be in charge of the person, then it can get really stressful for everyone involved. So it's much better if you start talking about that and thinking about that well before you need it. And then once you've gotten that far, you have to look at, does the person with autism need ongoing services? Do they need a personal care attendant? Do they need nursing assistance for some things? Again, it's very individual, but if you're going to need those types of services, health insurance doesn't necessarily cover those things. And what you're going to find is that you may, as an adult with autism, need some support on a daily or weekly basis, and you have to look at how that's going to be paid for. And one of the places that a lot of people turn is to the Medicaid system. Um, there are in-home services available in the Medicaid system. In order to qualify for those as an adult, you have to meet certain income and property guidelines. So, for example, if you have um, a substantial amount of money in the bank, you would have to spend that before you qualified for Medicaid, or you would have to place it in a special kind of trust. And that gets into yet another area of law that people with autism are going to encounter, and that's the law of trusts. A trust is a separate entity that is created to manage assets and to hold ownership of those assets. The reason why they're used for Medicaid purposes is that if the trust is written correctly, and it might be known as a special needs trust or a supplemental needs trust, it will be considered exempt when Medicaid looks at your assets. So you could put your own money in there, or someone else could put money in there for you. And those trusts are designed to cover things that Social Security and Medicaid do not cover. And they have to be written that way. And the person who is the beneficiary, the person with autism, cannot have cannot have any control over those funds. They have to be controlled by a separate trustee. The difference as to whether it's your money or it's someone else's money is an important one, because it governs what happens to that money if you don't end up using it all. If it's your money and you're a recipient of Medicaid benefits throughout your life, and there's something left when you pass, that money goes back to repay Medicaid. If it's someone else's money, they can designate somewhere else for it to go rather than going to Medicaid, if you don't end up using it all. And that leads to the final area that is touched on a little bit by people with autism, which is estate planning. If you are in that scheme of things where you've qualified for Social Security and you've qualified for Medicaid, and maybe you have a special needs trust, and let's say you have a parent or some other relative who could potentially want to leave you some money in their will or their trust for when they pass, you want to make sure that they don't leave it directly to the person with autism who's on Social Security or on a Medicaid waiver, because that could destroy their eligibility for their benefits. What you want to do is leave it to, for example, a special needs trust, so that you can provide, supplemental things for that person, but not destroy their eligibility for benefits. So those are the main areas, I think, that almost every person with autism is probably going to encounter at one point or another in their life. And they're all areas that are complex, and people really need to do their homework and get some assistance so they understand what their rights are with respect to all of those things.
Yeah, thank you. I don't see really any questions yet, but if someone's interested in finding a lawyer near where they are, how would they go about this?
That's a good question, because certainly in my state, and I think this is true most places, attorneys aren't really allowed to specialize. They're not allowed to say that they are an expert. But you do definitely want someone who prominently puts himself out there, to do the type of work you're looking at. And it depends on the area how plentiful attorneys are going to be. Is with regard to IDEA, I think there's not very many attorneys who do that sort of work, because frankly, it's very complicated and time consuming, and a lot of families can't afford to pay for legal and representation for that. Therefore, it's hard for attorneys to make a living doing that type of law. And so there's not very many. As far as IDEA, though, there's a terrific website. It's Rights Law, www.wrightslaw.com. And
By the way,
they're
I'm going to put that in the chat right now for anyone who's going to be interested in that.
yeah, Pete Wright is an attorney, and he has written a book about special education law that he continues, I believe, to update. And his wife is a child psychologist, and she's written a book about advocating for your child. Both of them I would highly recommend as a starting point for any parent who's got a special needs child in the public school system. And that website also has many resources that you can link to, as far as information about special education. Um, as far as the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Department of Justice, the United States Department of Justice website, if you Google that and Google Americans with Disabilities Act, there's a lot of information there about the rights and processes that are there under the ADA. Those are federal laws, IDEA and ADEA. When you get to the law of guardianship and conservatorship, that is state by state. Every state has, although I think they're fundamentally the same, they have their own little procedural differences and procedural quirks and different brands of red tape that you have to jump through. And so you're going to want to look for a estate planning attorney, or they might put themselves out as a probate attorney. But you want somebody that practices heavily in the county that you're in, who knows that county's probate procedures in order to understand those sorts of things. And similarly with Medicaid and estate planning, a lot of elder law attorneys might be a good resource because there's a lot of similarities between, or I guess overlap in the laws that are affected. So if you don't have somebody that specifically puts themselves out there as a special needs attorney, an elder law attorney would probably be your best bet on those sorts of things. And obviously, they can also do the estate planning side, which is what I do.
Okay. Looks like we have a few viewers now. Feel free to ask any questions. And let's see. Nothing has been asked, but do you have any other points that you would like to make, or is that everything?
I think I've covered all of the basics as far as the different areas of law that you might encounter and the way in which you might seek more information. I do want to say, though, that it is very important to educate yourself on these different laws and on your rights within them and plan ahead. You can save yourself and your family a lot of stress, anxiety, and grief if you start looking at these types of things before you need to. For example, if you have a child with autism, I would start looking at this when they're 2 or 3 years old. Don't wait until, okay, kindergarten's coming this fall before you start looking into how this process works and what you can expect the school district to provide. Because especially with autism, I can almost guarantee you that whatever your public school is going to provide, you're not going to think it's enough. And the reality is that the schools don't have to provide what you think is enough. They have to provide a minimum to provide that appropriate education. And the bar is just not that high. The Supreme Court's looked at this a couple of times, and it's just not much. One of the famous phrases about that was that you don't get a Cadillac, you get a Chevy. That's what you get in the public school, and they only have to pay for private school or private services if they cannot provide an appropriate education without doing that. So I've seen a lot of times parents want to pull their kid out of the school and they want to put them in a private school and they want the public school to pay for it. Well, you can't just do that. You have to go through all of the hoops with the school trying to get them to do the bare minimum. And it's only if they're not doing the bare minimum that you might have a case to put your child in another school, which I think honestly only happens these days in like very rural areas. And even then, what ends up happening, and it's a constant fight, is then they end up sending them to a different school. And now you have kids that aren't in their home school district anymore, but at least they're getting the services that the home school district just doesn't have the staff to provide. And it's always about money. I guarantee. I don't care what arguments they're giving you. It's always about how much do they have to spend.
That makes sense. Well, I think we're gonna just wrap this up. Thank you again for coming on.
My pleasure.
If anyone wants more of our content, please subscribe. And if you want more detailed information on something and law, please leave a comment asking what you would like, and we'll work on getting it for you. And have a great night. Bye.
Thank you.